Okay, fantastic. I'm not going to say a huge amount. I just want to say hello. I'm Al, one of the managers here at Housmans, and we are very thrilled to have with us tonight the Acid Horizon crew, who are going to be doing a live podcast recording, and also a kind of launch of their new amazing book of theory, philosophy, cybernetic theory, Anti-Oculus, of Ocularity, their theory of Ocularity. Not a huge amount left to say from me, I think. Not many events coming up. Next week, we're doing an event on the philosophy of drill and criminology with Adele Oliver's coming down from Birmingham to do that. Events on our website. Otherwise, there's no more housekeeping. I'm perfectly happy to hand over to you guys if you're good to go.
Great.
Thank you. Wicked.
Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Before we begin, I just want to thank Al, and it's Haseen, right? Who's working. And first faux pas, not even 2 minutes in. All right, great. But yes, thanks to Housman for hosting this event. This really means a lot to us. It's been hard to find a venue in the United States to do it. So Housman's now has the distinction of supporting us first, and we really appreciate that. Acid Horizon, the podcast, began in May of 2020 and June of 2020, perhaps too. And if there's one thing that Acid Horizon can be described as, it is an adventure in thought. And it's also the serendipitous gathering and collection of minds, spirits, bodies into a singular place to conduct this adventure of thought, to undergo and undertake this adventure of thought. And the themes in our book, Anti-Oculus, bear directly upon this sort of aleatory nature of this project, which was a rupture in what was the current state of things, the coronavirus pandemic of 2020. If you've been listening to the podcast, you probably know I was an educator in the Los Angeles County prisons, working on the side as a singer in Vegas on some weekends. Our fellows here were in either in undergrad programs or in the interim between their master's and PhD programs. And that was a scary and uncertain event for many people. But it also had the that particular moment also afforded us the opportunity to come together on something perhaps that we could describe as a latent drive or desire to undertake a mutual adventure in thought that would otherwise be impossible in the institutions that we have in our society today. And so it was with the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic and the George Floyd event that happened in June of 2020 that brought us together. And under the singular interest in Deleuze and Guattari's work, and then of course Foucault, Bataille, and all the other figures that we encounter on the podcast. And this, last night, was the first time I met these guys in person after knowing them for 3 years. And let me just tell you, just very quickly, my adventure in the UK this time has been phenomenal because in the past 48 hours, I've drunk more alcohol than I have in the past 48 weeks, right? And it says something about your country when the anarchist bookshop is the place of sobriety, right? And so here we are today to talk about Anti-Oculus, a philosophy of escape, a book of anti-cybernetics, a book that is also a philosophy of disability. It's also a book of insurrection. It's also a book that challenges what we consider the image of thought and also espouses a theory of how we might access this latent political imagination or multiple imaginations that we can then foster collectively in the same manner that Acid Horizon has done so very modestly as a podcast. And I have to begin by introducing this book really with Adam, because Adam's, how can I say, lockdown event and sort of emotional, I don't know, what would you call it? Well, we'll let Adam tell you what he went through at that time. But really, Adam's going to kind of give you an overview of the project for the book because it's Adam who had the sort of incipient idea that became the book. And then we were moved, Will and I, by his writing to add to that and to think alongside him. And then, of course, to think together, like where even Adam's ego, perhaps, or his His individuality was merged into ours, and we engaged in this sort of like collective writing experiment that I think I think in some ways expressed the ethos of the podcast, our Patreon supporters, everyone who listens to us. And before I hand it over to Adam, I just want to say thank you all for supporting us here at this event tonight and for the past 3 years. And so without further ado, Adam C. Jones.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming here. And so, okay, first, this is a book of anti-cybernetics. Cybernetics, what is it? It's mostly a buzzword if you hear it in the mouths of tech bros, but it does have a historical meaning. It is the science of control and communication in the animal and machine. Its main concepts are feedback loops, information, which is defined as a difference which makes a difference, which is a definition which didn't make much of a historical difference in the history of information thought, but still very useful for us. And it's thinking about mostly this category of, if I'm going to see sort of the William Burroughs sort of emblazoned on me here, control. Now, control is something of it's a weird topic to start off, thinking about control from the perspective of the last few years. Because what has felt more out of control than the political situation? What are the political conditions of possibility of Matt Hancock, let's say? The lack of, he is very much out of control, but he is very much part of a control system. Now, what we mean by control is actually a bit less in this William Burroughs sense of there are people controlling things somewhere, there's this group that's directing things. Rather, what we want to talk about is control in the sense of habits, apparatuses, general processes that have accumulated throughout history, and ways in which governments preempt, defuse, and respond to reaction and revolt. Reactions to revolt, I'd say. The theory of control, mostly through here, I'll just give you a break through the chapters. The first chapter is called The Cyberpunk Present, and it looks at the ways in which cyberpunk theory of fiction has some grounding in reality. Now, historically, attempts to do this have not gone very well. Craig was suggesting I had some sort of mental episode. We are not doing a Nick Lands. He is the enemy. Stop giving him anime recommendations, for the love of God. We want to sort of revitalize cyber theory from a position of not having any optimism about what these machines are going to do for us. We did the CCRU, we did the allegiance with the machines. These machines were Twitter. They turned us into parts in their production line, which is producing data, producing content, producing metrics, and essentially being the power supply for the communicative apparatuses of the day. And also cyberpunk, one of the most underrated aspects of theory that tries to bring cyberpunk into everything, is that regulation, cyberpunk, cybernetic implants, if you abstract them from all the cool tech shit which didn't actually arrive, there's a lot of examples of cybernetics being applicable, particularly in the realms of healthcare. We think about cybernetic limbs, insulin pumps, things that respond to essentially the main aspects of human life, human regulation of biological functions. And we think cyberpunk, a fist that can basically respond to pressure, learn to block people's attacks and so forth. But really, cybernetics is mostly about control, regulation, and indeed, as we see a lot in struggles over healthcare today, the regulation of people's bodies in advance. The system only admits in what is permissible to what the system can recognize. And what is recognizable defines ocularity. What powers defines you in advance as what the menus of availability are. But that's chapter 3. Chapter 2, however, is an introduction to the field of cybernetics itself. And it's also a guide of how to fight cops. It is a look at cybernetics through the lens of the most commonly applied cybernetics field, or in the field really, which is not implants necessarily. It's not, flying cars. It's riot control. Kettling, containment, based on the fundamental model that all cyberneticians use as their example, which is a thermostat. And just to unpack that a bit, I'm going to talk about the main concept of cybernetics. Not all of them. There's more detail in here, but most of them, pretty much all of them, are relevant here. So we've got feedback loops. So the first, most famous one, the most typical one is negative feedback. A thermostat, for example, it's a negative feedback device. When you generate heat, in order to maintain it at a certain level, it periodically moves against the direction of travel of that system, which is a heat generation system. A thermostat is a way of the heater essentially communicating with itself to temporarily switch itself off or lower the generation of heat to maintain a stable equilibrium. That is our theory of riot control, essentially, particularly looking at interviews with comrades who've been kettled, for example, in the student riots and under the raised tuition fees, and also interviews with cops themselves. We didn't actually conduct those interviews, thank God. But there's also famously positive feedback, vicious circles, things spiraling out of control. This was the thing that Nick Land thought was going to save us. Did it? My ass. But there's also this underrated concept we try to hone in on, which is feed forward. Negative feedback requires error in order to correct something. You can't correct something unless something's gone wrong. Feed forward is the attempt to preempt error before error even occurs. Question is, how do you recognize when something's gone wrong? You have a categories, you have schemas of error that define it in advance. And so chapter 3 is essentially our attempt to look at all these mechanisms of feed forward and how they developed historically through feedback. What you can be recognized as, this is our most CCRU moment. It's my most paranoiac moment. Because I wrote most of that part during the lockdown when everyone was so snitchy in the suburbs. The police had eventually stopped telling everyone to report on each other for having a walk longer than 2 fucking hours. But that's the English middle classes for you, eh? But Ocularity is essentially my attempt to write a catalogue, almost from the perspective of a McKinsey, but a bit more tongue-in-cheek, of all of the ways in which identity and becoming can be policed in advance. It's a history of disability, a history of gender and sexuation, for history of the very conditions of possibility of transphobia, ableism, the historical contingencies of development of the apparatus of race, mostly through people like Robinson, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, etc. And it tries to essentially provide the conceptual tools to understand both how they work and their limits. Because when you understand, if you write a counter-insurgency manual, it's basically a manual of how to reverse engineer it. The implications of that. But that is the limit of my chapters, and I think I've probably gone for quite a bit too much here. So in that case, I'll pass it to our resident emo Foucauldian, and if he has quote tweeted you at any point, feel free to tell him this afterwards. I'll pass it on to Will.
Well, let me say we'll be standing him up after the show just for a brief slap for anyone who wants. But anyway,
If he hasn't told you about your takes on Foucault, we can't stop you. Look,
take it away, Will.
I am the only Foucauldian, first of all. But no, really, the chapter that I had the largest hand in is called Going Astray. And what it is an attempt at capturing a particular kind of politics of subjectivation and desubjectivation that puts at its forefront the gap between an ocular mechanism, right, that initiates the political project of recognition and subjectivation. And the way that I wanted to focus on this is through one small line in the last text of Michel Foucault, which was a book, which was a preface to a book by Canguilhem, the new edition of The Normal and the Pathological. Canguilhem is, by and large, probably the philosopher who lurks most quietly in all of our interests. He's someone with whom, if you're not acquainted, you really ought to be. But the reason why I wanted to focus really on this concept of error is that what is quietly suggested by Foucault in this preface to The Normal and Pathological is that it is only through the production of error that life actually manifests as an epistemologically knowable object. And with this concept of error, with this kind of metaphysics of emergence through error, we now know that it's something that becomes manageable, recognizable, and eliminable. So really, my focus was on precisely how particular modes of existence predicated on an errancy that becomes error, a straying that becomes error, a mode of existence that precedes power that is then treated as resistance. What is that process like? And one of the things that I think is kind of maliciously quiet in Foucault's corpus, which is strange given his focus, is disability. Disability is brought up for the equivalent of like 5 minutes in a lecture series called Abnormal, delivered at the College of France, but he quickly brushes it aside to focus on this notion of monstrosity. I think this was a mistake. So what I'm trying to do is to find a politics of disability. But what I found when I was trying to do this is essentially two things. That abnormality is a mode of identification that really works to identify anarchy, to identify the undoing of the social order based on the degeneration of the human population or the threat of that degeneration. But what I also found in an earlier lecture series is quite literally the opposite, that anarchy throughout the history of medical science is reducible to abnormality. Cesare Lombroso, a famous criminologist, if you work or study criminology, he is the foundation of your science. In the same way that if you study ego psychology, you can try as hard as you want to refute Freud as the foundation of your science, you will fail. But Cesare Lombroso, a famous criminologist, also a socialist advocate for a long period of time, went to France to study and received still images of anarchist organizers, anarchist agitators at particular uprisings, and did essentially a facial analysis. And what he found was that the large majority of them had deformities. And he compared this to Corday and Marx, who had no deformities. They actually embody the perfect physical corpus. Like, I would like you to think of Karl Marx's body as perfect, just for one moment. So what essentially this hinges on is that in anarchy, there is a through line to abnormality, a reduction to a biological insufficiency, to that which needs to be reached, understood, and pulled back in to the nomos of the norm, right? Which doesn't exist, of course. And then in abnormality, what we find in the foundation of disability studies, which would be Edouard Séguin, is it's attributable to a cosmic kind of, almost an ontological mode of anarchy. For Séguin, the disabled child, the internal forces of their mode of existence, particularly those who would later be diagnosed with what we now conventionally call either Down syndrome, autism. These diagnostic categories were very different, but they generally came across, we generally come across two standard diagnoses. The first being the idiot, and the second being the imbecile. And what Séguin argues is that the abnormality of the idiot is corrective. And what we need to do is build large institutions where these children can undergo gait analysis, can undergo behavioral training, and then can re-enter society with some level of productivity. Now, one of the things that I think is understated in the history of disciplinary apparatuses is that particularly when it comes to enclosure when it comes to a politics of utility, I think disabled children in particular are often at the vanguard of those developments that will later become standard behavioral practices. Like in the United States, job search programs are based on Chicago institutions that were responses to a book entitled The Young Cripple and His Job. So the through line here is really a relationship between disability identification and then finally, and I'll be brief, subjectivity. And I think one of the things that the notion of subjectivation allows us to do is to sort of take seriously the claims that power makes about our position, right? Because we are all in a positional situation. We're always positioned. And what I think I find in Foucault's work are kind of two modes of subjectivity and really the endless process, the unfolding of subjectivation breaking down. The first mode being that which refutes it, not on the grounds of production or on the grounds of affirmation of their relation to production, specifically in what Foucault calls the illegalism of dissipation. Dissipation, or what was conventionally called moral nomadism, became a really crucial problem, particularly in England and France in the 18th and early 19th century, where the machine breakers were no longer a problem. Labor organizing had been basically flattened by really the emergence of new property relations that still kind of define the world that you all live in day to day. It's totally different in the US, but no more could these sort of underground networks of commodity theft and trading occur. That was essentially precluded. But what became the new problem was, rather than workers destroying simply the machinery of the mode of production, the means of production, what the worker now did was withhold their own personal labor potentiality, do damage to that instead. So a moral drunkenness becomes the fundamental problem. Leaving work, collecting paychecks when one hasn't been, lying on your work stamp, having your friends go in and punch your time card. This became the fundamental issue. And this is much harder to manage, right? Because what one has to do, at least according to, ironically, Colquhoun being the major scientist of Great Britain on policing, is reach in to the moral core of the worker and fundamentally alter the way in which they perceive themselves. So this is the fundamental challenge now. It's not just the machine breakers, although I think they get a bad rap. It's this new kind of machine breaking, which is to take seriously the claim that, sure, okay, if you see man as a machine, if I'm merely a machine, then I'm going to operate in a different way. And then, so there's this mode of refusing one's subject position rather than affirming it. And then there's the mode of affirming it to a point of short-circuiting the value of its position. And I have several examples of this that were really important to me, but the two that I'll focus on is the Tool prison riot and the ADAPT protest, because it brings us back to, I think, disability and the ephemeral possibility of a general strike that doesn't rely on a circumscribed notion of proletarian valorization, which I think at least since the workerist movement in Italy has been one of the fundamental problems. So to start with the Tool prison riot, it was fundamentally different from Attica. It was fundamentally different from the three uprisings in France prior to it, where suicides or attacks on prison guards or riots were the fundamental strategy. Instead, what the prisoners in Tool did was bar themselves into the prison, force all of the prison guards out, and not let them back in until certain demands were met. So rather than escaping their prison, what they did was escape prison as such. No penalties were given to prison guards. They were let out peacefully. As far as we know, violence was extremely limited during the Tool riots. And negotiations were done through the clergy of the prison, who volunteered to stay back. And one of the men who was a fundamental or a crucial organizer, what he said was, it's really only the clergy that see us as men. So they knew not to go through wardens or, let's say, orthodox processes, because they do exist, right? You do have, there are legal processes for prisoners to make demands. But they said, no, we'll do it if France is going to claim to be this remarkably Catholic country, which at the time, after really the failure of the de Gaulle government, there was this right-wing resurgence. They challenged that. And I think what the Toul prison revolt shows is that one can move so deeply into the game of confinement that the prison can very easily become a barricade. And I think that in the same way that when Agamben speaks of Benjamin as an individual who is trying to show us that after the law, what we do is play with it like a child plays with a toy, I think we have to extend this. I don't think this is sufficient enough. I think rather than remaining reliant on the law, right, it's now a question of if who we are is always challenged by the juridical and disciplinary mechanisms that we associate ourselves with, and that allow for the kinetics of capital to exist, is either to engage in a kind of kenosis or to play with those kinetics like a child plays with a toy. And then the final example, and then I'll hand it off to Craig, and I just want to make one point about epistemology, is the ADAPT protest in Denver, Colorado. The organization wasn't called ADAPT, but it had such a long name that I'm not going to repeat it now. In Denver, Colorado, this is a simple liberal issue. They were having a busing upgrade. The Colorado and the federal government gave them a remarkable amount of money in a categorical grant, which means it's for a specific issue. It's not a block grant. And the ADAPT protesters formed a really standard political wing and started trying to negotiate with lawmakers to say, look, they need lifts. They need at least a certain level of accessibility. They need to go to government provided housing, which was an issue in Denver. So they negotiated for months and nothing worked. So these buses arrive, they don't have lifts. And this becomes, I think, a last straw. And what these protesters recognized in the 70s, long before the really British glorification of cybernetics. I mean, you guys fetishize this for a long time. I mean, it's a little nauseating, but like, whatever. What they recognize, I think, more than Nick Land, or more than any contemporary thinker of biopolitics, especially Agamben, was that to circulate is to survive. That it's not simply an ontological clamping onto the presence of one's life, although that's important because that's what makes the biopolitical schematic possible. But it means if you cannot move through the metropolis, you will not live. And this is a really, 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 really fundamental break. Because what these disabled activists refused to do was to arrive at what the Invisible Committee calls the trash heap of the population. And it's why I think discussions about selective euthanasia in Canada that get reduced to Marxian notions of surplus population are kind of gross, because they occlude the actual substance of a politics of abnormality in favor of a general schematizing of really the 1920s politics of a proletarian socialism. But more than anything, what I think Adam's work brought me to, and what really colored this piece, was that there is this gap, this space between panoptic control, its politics of recognition that we get through Adam's reading of Hegel, and the processes of subjectivation that produce for us an immanent field. And I think that the space of, call it what you want, the imaginary party, the mass, the black bloc, it doesn't matter, is in that gap. And it's finding ways in which these modes of subjection are dependent on producing particular subjectivities, taking those processes seriously and finding the holes in the biopolitical fabric and staying there, that I think is really the challenge. And it can only be done through understanding the epistemological field that biopolitics necessarily needs. So the challenge is still, I think, to think insurgency. This remains the problem of our era after the 70s, is that we're still living in this counter-revolutionary, counter-insurgent moment in which any given shard of insurrectionary capacity is immediately captured by a radical politics of organization that then becomes the PSL, right? So I think we have to evade contemporary modes of political epistemology, which is why even though I'm terrified of any mention of Jung, I reach for the revolver, strapped to my ankle. I had to let some of it slip by with Craig. So yeah, without further ado, like the imageless image.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, let's take a little break here. And I want you to imagine that you're in your mid-40s and you're working with these two young men who are about half your age, right? One of them's writing on anti-cybernetics. The other's writing on the philosophy of disability. And they have an incredible involvement and depth of knowledge in these research fields. And here I am writing happy little middle-aged screeds about archetypal psychology on my laptop in my forest abode and thinking to myself, how the hell am I going to write something for this book, right? And so I also want you to think too, and just a show of hands here maybe, and you don't have to show your hand. Like, I imagine that a lot of you are involved in philosophy, sociology, political theory, something like that. And have you ever felt at any point in your career that you had kind of like fallen off and like, I don't know what direction I'm going, something like that? Anybody like that? That's interesting. I never felt like that. Never felt. Now, just kidding. That was just a setup. But seriously, what I wanted to take very serious in this project was I wanted to actualize what I thought was the positive political dimension of this project, which was, in part, first, to undertake a creative act of thinking itself, and to be moved by the community of writers and thinkers and podcast listeners and all of the other philosophical mediators that I was working with, and set up a stage to advance my apprenticeship in philosophy and thought, which is something that I think is really important for us to do from time to time. I mean, how many of you, and I'm not going to do a gotcha on this one, but how many of you roll around in your head like thinking, okay, Adorno versus Deleuze, or Marx versus, Bakunin, or something like that, right? And you may be struggling from time to time on certain issues. And I think those tensions are important in advancing the apprenticeship. And so what I wanted to do was, I don't want, here we are in the anarchist bookshop, don't want to say serve too many masters, but I wanted to create a field in which a certain set of antagonisms, or what I call in the book agonies, come into play, where the apprenticeship of philosophy, this encounter with philosophical mediators, comes into force. And I'm moved by my creative interlocutors as well, and use it as a place to elaborate a point of interest in my own research, which was political imagination and epistemology. And I mean, these guys are on PhD track. I have my master's degree in philosophy. Any just master's degree people here tonight? Any just undergrad people here tonight? Yeah, no, that's great. And let me just press pause for a second. I've really been granted the gift and privilege of being able to return to philosophy in my life after doing so many things, a singer in Vegas, and working in a prison, teaching ESL, right? And then, we come to this point in our lives. I was able to stave off a midlife crisis by dint of this podcast, right? So, it was wonderful to have that moment come back to me again, where I was able to think, right? And I mean, especially in the West, in our lives, to create the space of thought, to create the creative act for oneself, right? And affirm it. And so with that said, I went meditating on this, and I wanted to honor the notion that, the politics of recognition is all over the book. And what I thought was absolutely necessary was to create a concept, to actually undertake some philosophical alchemy and think of not only a term, but a set of coordinates that this term kind of flowed between that would help us understand not only the conditions by which we are able to think the new, but the conditions by which we are able to reclaim our political imagination such that it doesn't get reinscribed within the already extant form of politics that exists in our social field. All the while, bringing in psychoanalysis, Deleuze, and all my faves. And so this concept of the imageless image that I write about in the book begins with a conceptual persona. And there was a figure that I really didn't know a lot about until I met these guys, of Marguerite Perret. I'm not sure how many of you have read her work. She was 14th century, William of Paris, right? Had subjugated her, and basically in the manner of Inquisition. And she had basically an experience of divine vision, with which whatever she saw in her vision manifested in the form of a kind of theological manifesto that was at odds with the dogma of the church. And I thought that this was a very apt sort of image, an actual image and a figure that we could use to describe the idea of a political imagination bubbling up from us individually, collectively, within a group, but immediately gets suppressed by the existing state of affairs and the despotism of thought, the despotism of the dominant paradigm and hegemony and so forth. And so one of the things that really impressed me about the example with Marguerite Perret, and I don't know how certain I can be about the actual history, but the one detail about her life and death that really struck me was the idea that when she was being burned at the stake, when the flames rose up around her, her face, her countenance maintained complete equanimity, no response whatsoever. And it just made me imagine, once again, being so committed to a vision, ideal of a beatific vision, an image of God, an image of one's redemption, an image of one's absolution, not to have one's soul engulfed in the punishment leveled by the powers that be, right? And to me, I thought that was a fantastic way to start a meditation about the ways in which the new bubbles up in the form of images, and the idea or conceit that even our philosophical paradigms have a political imagination behind them. There are images. There are something tantamount to perhaps to dream in images, fantasies, certain presuppositions about the world. And I wanted to show what I believed was the nexus between those two spaces, right? Where our political imagination develops, where it grounds itself, where it fails to ground itself, and where our ideas, our truth schemas, how they do things in a very similar manner. And so for me, this idea of the imageless image demanded that I put two interlocutors into play, which was first Deleuze and Deleuze and Guattari in their work in A Thousand Plateaus and Anti-Oedipus and so forth, and the ways in which they theorize the notion of multiplicity against this sort of persistent monism that we find perhaps in the work of Freud. We certainly find it in forms of religion and theology and so forth, and the ways in which that I think the development of this concept of multiplicity and the idea that we can understand political imagination one's personal individuation, a collective individuation of a group or assemblage, as being fundamentally different than anything else that could actually manifest. There's nothing like something else to the point where the one thing can completely subsume the other as a category of the other thing. And so the imageless image was this attempt to sort of create an epistemological grounding that was capable of undermining the very grounds through which the concept attempted to ground itself. And I think this is part of the grounding ethos of not only the book, but also of Acid Horizon. This way in which that we reintroduce ourselves to the apprenticeship of philosophy, to the adventure of thought, right? To the aleatory nature of life, and rediscovering life outside of those imposed categories that are put upon us. And with that said, that is more or less the whole of our book. Is there something else that we want to say before we move to the Q&A?
I'll throw some things to get right.
Yeah, let's go for it.
I mean, so yeah, Jungian psychoanalysis, Foucauldian takes on disability theory. How does this all relate to cybernetics? The answer is they don't, and that's the point. Because this is a philosophy of not of capture, of mapping, of cybernetic systemic diagrams, but a philosophy of escape. This isn't escape in the sense of, this what the cybernetic communes were in the 60s and 70s, which is a middle-class white flight which deprives the inner cities and the urban struggles of everything that they really need, which is class traitors who can afford fucking bail. This is about the escaping of capture. The escaping of capture is essentially a revisiting of this real bugbear in cyber theory, which is the distinction between the map and the territory. With Baudrillard, and this isn't a huge critique of Baudrillard, but there's been this habit of thinking nothing's real anymore, the map precedes the territory, everything's more real than real, everything's hypermediatized, and to some extent that's true. But we need to start looking at it again as a process of production, as a process of capture, and of the violence of that capture. And the name of the violence of that capture is empire. The violence of the map against the territory is the violence of the Israeli state today in Palestine. It is the violence of supervening categories upon a land that marks it out as abstractions, as a territory to be reduced to that through actual violence. It is the violence of racialization, which strips people of their claims, strip people of their history, people of their, it reduces you to what Locke would call a tabula rasa, a blank slate, the violence of erasure. And we give so many examples of escape, and these examples of things that have escaped capture and led to the entire system burning the fucking thing down. One of the examples we give is the Haitian Revolution. To what the recognition isn't in the subject. Subjectivation isn't necessarily in the subject. It's in the barriers that police what the subject can do as an embodied being. An example we give in, obviously we've got Will's example of the Tours prison riot, the Craig example of Marguerite Perret, and the example of Ocularity is people like Mackendal, the Maroon slave, Obeah practitioner, that's a spiritual practice. And that example is so poignant for me because it's, whilst the slaves recognized these chantings as satanic babble, it was a consciousness, it was a source of nourishment. Cedric Robertson talks about being a source of material nourishment. And indeed, the slave owners couldn't recognize what they were doing amongst each other, and that was allowed them to fight back and destroy the slave plantation economy of Haiti. And even going into contemporary aspects of policing movement today, the idea of losing control. I mean, Israel's got the most cybernetically inaugurated army in the first place, in human history, basically. I mean, they've got all the data, they've got loads of drones, Elbit makes them here, Leonardo make them here. Bulldozer, smart, they can be as smart as the people who program people that use them. If they're being used by a bunch of genocidal racists, they're not exactly the best at information technology and discernment. There are ways of short-circuiting things, and when we talk about the imageless image escape, we're talking about the production of that which escapes capture, and which capture is constantly trying to preempt, but it can't fully evade, because control, as William Burroughs once says, requires resistance to be control. Otherwise, you're just using things. There's no space of resistance. And that condition of resistance actually precedes power itself. And I think that's sort of the way to tie all together, all this together, because it is a philosophy of resistance first and foremost, a philosophy of escape, not a philosophy of capture. And on that note, on that sort of rather bombastic note, maybe we should open it up to a Q&A and just thank everyone again for coming.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Actually, before I forget, if you bought a copy of the book, or you're going to buy one tonight, I have this nifty stamp that when I send books out, like I used to live in Japan, and
We'll actually sign it as well, but it's a double.
yeah, I used to live in Japan, and everything stamps over there, and like the stamp culture stayed with me, and I just think it's really nice to have a stamp inside the book. And if you have the stamp, that means we've had our hands on it. So be sure to get the stamp. Yeah. With that said, Al,
Very anti-Foucauldian of us, frankly.
that's right. Captured. Do we have a mic to be passed around for the Q&A? Yeah, great.
Yeah. So, any questions?
Or comment. Oh, there she is.
Hello, hello.
Hi.
I have a really, really simple question, which is, does this book have a concept of capitalism?
There we go. It has a concept of cybernetic capitalism insofar as it doesn't have a theory of capital in the sense of, I'm not going like C Capital Volume 1. But a lot of the theory of capitalism based in it is based on a shift from basically new frontiers of capital itself and capital extraction, which is mostly the capitalization of data. Because data is the hot new commodity. It was debts, 2008, and the fact that no one's got any money to pay it makes it a less hot commodity. But the thing is about data production, especially in the imperial core here, you can produce it just by moving through any old shit ticket barriers. You're constantly producing metrics, how long you look at the screen for. But also there's a dark shadow to this data economy, not only the material sense of sort of capital of extracting resources, for example, in the ongoing genocide in Congo, but also the ways in which these machines are moderated and trained. The so-called micro work systems like Mechanical Turk, for example, made by Jeff Bezos and Amazon. The AI is just a guy. People in refugee camps are increasingly, and Phil Jones has an amazing book on this, not to plug someone else's book, but if you see it around, banger. It's a really good book. It goes into the way in which these systems of control the data is created by the very people displaced by the capitalist machine, which needs that data control them in the first place. I mean, you think about it in the sense of the semio-capitalist flows of moving from counter-insurgency to Northern Ireland, training people like the Mujahideen in the 80s with British help against the Soviets. That information leaks out at the same time the British are also exporting that data into Israel and Palestine. Today, Elbit systems sell their weapons as battle-tested on Palestinians. This is a capitalism of data and a capitalism that sells its communications infrastructure. Is it going to be a fear of? It's almost no. There's no fear of capitalism in the same way there's not a Metallica cover on the average death metal album. It's there. It's presupposed. It's the knowledge. That's my best example. Yeah, sorry, but I think that's yeah.
And actually, I don't think it's a theory of capitalism per se, but a theory of capital, or at least of surplus and appropriation, in the sense that in the Imageless image, I quote Laruelle, where Laruelle says that philosophy is the capital form of thought, right? This idea that the greatest thoughts that we have, the most profound thoughts, philosophy is the sort of overcoating attractor of all of those things, right? And that for any thought to be valid in a certain sense, like one way that we could perhaps think about that is that it is philosophized.
Yeah.
What I do is I espouse that psychoanalysis, broadly construed, is the capital form of the image and the imagination. And there's actually an interesting example that I can't say that I am the progenitor of this example. I have to thank the author, Gerald Ronick. I don't know if you've read his works on semiotext, but he talks about this concept that you can find in the works of in ancient Rome, from Plautus to Terence, this idea of dividuum falcere. This idea that, for example, our individuality, then this is something that Nietzsche kind of gets into, but we kind of explode the concept beyond a normal sense of, or a conventional sense of individuality, which I don't necessarily think Nietzsche has. But how can we understand multiplicities, collectives, assemblages as appropriable items, as something that can be almost divided up or cut up like swine, to be sold at market as bacon and chops and so forth. This concept of dividuum falcere was applied to, for example, landlords, other sort of members of the ruling class who laid claims to strands of surplus that were attributable to sex workers and slaves within ancient Rome, such that if, for example, a particular sex worker or a slave had a measurable output of labor, that any one of these members of the ruling class could say, well, 33% is mine, 40% is yours, and the remaining 22% belongs to you. And so I think there's a way in which I try to use this idea of capital broadly construed as a way to rethink epistemology. In what ways are these epistemological categories ways to territorialize these categories or constructs or paradigms such that the life itself is sapped of its creativity or preempted from a kind of creative event? Any? Oh yeah. Anything that
Do you want an answer? Like, for me, the question is, what precisely does prime accumulation mean in Capital Volume 1, right? And for me, that's always been an interesting question, because I always feel as though Marx touches on this subject very briefly in passages on large-scale industry. But I think it remains kind of a quiet element of Capital Volume 1, and then it lurks in its kind of infancy in, frankly, the 1844 manuscripts, right, where a new kind of installed bourgeois morality that attempts to make life absolutely isomorphic with labor is not just a shift in the approach of what we understand labor to be, but is in fact a new metaphysical field where life becomes precisely that which Marx will later call a body that's cut up on the factory floor, right? So with the accumulation of prime capital, there's also an accumulation of bodies, but this can't be reduced to a purely, and when I say material, I don't mean it in that way, a pure material collection. It has to be, I think, predicated on a reinterpretation of the world. And I think Marx, for all the flaws that we want to attribute to his youthful writings, one thing that he touches on and then moves in I think a more post-Feuerbachian way, he touches on this. So I really think that if the question for Anti-Oculus is, when life, and not just production, but the kinetics of production become, when life and control become absolutely co-reliant, where we can only understand who we are through not just these broad sovereignties that we attribute to things, but in fact, like the very self-propelled force, the mode of control that says yes, that affirms every single thing that we do. What is left of life? There's no space. And what we want to attest to is this form of nihilism is actually wrong, that there actually still remains this gap. And it's within this gap that we need to start to forge a new imagination. And so, I don't, so my answer would be, I don't think this book necessarily has, let's say, a theory of capital, in as much as it doesn't lay out the process of commodity production. But for me, when I read Really Burn Your Way Out, what I see is a critique of the metaphysical assumptions that contemporary modes of production depend upon. So no, but it's a different kind of, I don't want to say the Kantian thing, it's the conditions. It's not. It's trying to. There are many different ways into the problem, and what Anti-Oculus, I think, does, if it does anything individually articulable is it exposes this gap.
So, does anyone else have any questions? Not all of the answers will contradict each other.
Let's go for it.
I'll just wait for the full house freedom. Yeah, I'm sorry, but yeah. So it can be on the recording.
Cheers. I want to preface this with this is trying to pull out a contradiction in the text, and I want to preface that with this is not like I'm going to cite you, it's a gotcha. I really don't want it to be taken in that spirit. I also haven't finished the book, so my answer might be preempted in the end. But in one of the chapters that I believe you wrote, Adam, you talk about community and the commune and establishing its own closed loops. And then last night when I was reading Going Astray, I read something quite striking from Will's section. The problem about here's wherever there's a society claiming community, one finds only mechanisms of defense. And obviously there's a sort of, are we trying to create a commune if every community actually turns into a sort of reactive, defensive, cybernetic system? And I think there might be a productive tension in there. I was just wondering if you could speak to that tension.
I mean, well, I'll start also. I mean, in terms of there's a strong, and this is very much an etymological argument that goes to the heart of the root of the word community, which is the together, and the munus, which is a gift or obligation. And if you read it as an obligation, it becomes a matter of deciding the in and the out crowd. The immune is etymologically the inverse of commune. You're not in community. You don't have the same communal obligations. Will doesn't like being obligated to do things, of course. No. But in terms of the actual theoretical tension between the idea of community and control, I mean, there's a great line from Mark Fisher where he's like, care and community. There's a great line from, like Facci, there's a great controlling line of care in the community by selling off all of the assets. And it's like, why do we have care without community? Why is this buy-in? Why is it not unconditional? It's problematic. It even goes into the work of, apologies, very French, Jacques Derrida, this idea of hospitality. The root of hospitality and hostility is the same one, the hostis. Because hospitality, you're given all of these things as a guest, but you're placed under the conditions of guesthood, which is restriction of being a good kind of guest. And you don't set those terms. How do you know when you're a guest or not? And there is a productive tension there, absolutely. I mean, the section on chapter 2, which is my discussion of short-circuiting and the theory from Michelle O'Brien, whose book is here as well, actually, the comments. I'm stealing lots of books today, but the communization of care. And I think the communization of care is worth doing in terms of communization versus a commune, which is essentially a subtraction of the barriers to communization, a subtraction or a short-circuiting of these systems which, for example, maintain, the gender division of reproductive labor, as well as the gender divisions as fixed entities themselves. I mean, there's definitely a productive tension there between our respective anarchies. I mean, there's a postscript to that chapter, which is a kind of a yearning for maybe we can do in our cybernetics, which is there's something we might, at least in some air traffic control, I'm fine with that. I mean, that cybernetics system I'm fine with. Traffic lights sometimes, it's all right. I mean, but insulin pumps, medicine sometimes, it's just a matter of the control there. And there's a productive tension in that work. But in terms of the notion of community, when we talk about communization versus as a novel community or a novel form of communication between each other that's not mediated through these preemptive systems, I think there's definitely something to be said of even the sort of community established by, for example, the ADAPT protest. The ADAPT protest, as we were saying, it's we're not moving anywhere because you've excluded us. That means we're going to generalize our own immobility, and you fuckers aren't going anywhere either. And that is a form of communication. It's a form of raw tactility of the disabled body, which says, okay, this is the limit of the system. We're going to generalize the limit of the system that you have imposed on us. I mean, this is how we was at the PSC demo in Hackney today. As I say in chapter 2, actually, every cop becomes a traffic cop. It is all about securing the flows of things around you. And even with the Met Police making sure, we banned all the protests at the stations, because even standing still scares the shit out of them. They are terrified of people standing still, because what are you not going to work? You're not going to Pretz. And there's a kind of communication there. There's establishing of a new kind of link. And maybe this might be a point of indeed productive tension. But on that note, I mean, let's produce some tension.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, of course, this remains the challenge. But I want to go back to the sentence. The word here is a society imposing community, right? And this is when the etymology that were provided by Adam really becomes helpful, in as much as the minus has to be the fundamental element of a circumscriptive society, right? So what we're trying to escape is this false opposition between civil society and the state. And why society has to claim community is the same reason Spinoza has to claim a universal in communis sensus, right? The one thing that Kant will take kind of passingly in the CPR is this, where when I see that, and it's why I'm not a political Spinozist, I know Balabar's beloved here, so it is an imposed commonality that becomes the condition of possibility for society, which must always be defended. So the tension is really in finding ways in which we come together that are not necessarily, this is not a politics of a universal communism. This very much is not that. What this is the production of imagining forms of life where the way in which we exist is inseparable from our existence itself, right? And it's that imposition of community that forces us either within a circumscription or the inclusionary exclusion it relies on. So in a sense, yes, there's a productive tension, but in another, forms of life, that this is what Tikkun will say, take on a clinamen, right? They take on a particular, I hate this word, but characteristic. And this is, of course, always going to proliferate civil wars, right? But the point is that in such proliferation, we find the absolute breaking point of particular kinds of social control. So while this tension exists, it's that tension that we have to inhabit, right? This tension is not something to say is that which we need to avoid or evade, but it actually to embrace this tension, to take this up as the problem of the political, right? Rather than actually taking the Derridian position on immunity, which necessarily always has to put democracy in this thing to come, right? What we do is we actually take this as the initial starting point. So I like that you point out this tension, because I think that this tension is in fact the very thing that society attempts to preclude, because it has to foreclose on forms of ethical existence in favor of separating the way in which we might live into the fact of our bare existence, our bare life, which I think is completely redefined in the cybernetic era, right? Because bare life can actually exist outside of the sovereign paradigm now, right? So I think that pointing out that tension, I think, just enriched my reading of the book. So I really like that you caught that. And obviously there are we just had 3 different interpretations of the question that we were asked about capital, right? Like there's this famous moment where I think either Deleuze or Guattari get up to go to the bathroom, make a coffee or something, and Deleuze comes back to the table and the interviewer's like, he just contradicted everything you said. And Deleuze said, that's great. Let's keep going. So I don't think that this is a book where 3 of us were arguing, the 3 of us don't agree on everything. But we have a shared commitment that we will not abandon and therefore can't abandon each other. So in that sense, it's only in those differences that I'm permitted to understand Adam as a political thinker. So yeah, like I think pointing out that tension is good.
Well, as an instigator of community and an avid reader of Nietzsche, I don't need to explain myself. Yeah, we'll take another question, I suppose. Oh, we have one in the back. The gentleman in the back. Yeah.
So I know, Leon, you spoke a little bit about the process of writing the book, but I'm curious about, the three of you coming from different kind of angles and then trying to marshal your ideas into a single entity. How did you go about making decisions about the structure and the narrative that you were going to try and take the reader on?
Well, I guess I'll start by saying that, like I said at the beginning, Adam was kind of the original font of the initial idea of Ocularity. And I think if you develop a philosophical friendships and a collective, and, it's really like an arena, or, a word that I use in the book, an agon of powers. Like, somebody comes up with a term, they try to assert that term against the other. It's a kind of play. There's a kind of force, and there's a love in there too. And some of these terms win out, others do not. Some take a precedence, others do not. And maybe the dynamic shifts over various paragraphs, various chapters, and so forth. A term might appear, it might recede. It might serve a function in one case, it might serve a different function in another case. And this is something that I try to address with the imageless image. And I don't think you get this with a strict kind of intentionality, like, all right, here's what we're going to do. This happens over, months, literally 3 years of just working with people, on the podcast, informal conversations. And, that's a big part about it. Just to bring in Deleuze a little bit here, I think the non-philosophical dimension of our friendship, our assemblage, and our alliance often bears with it some of the germs that then become the philosophical concepts, right? You never know in a given day, in a given encounter, a given car accident, or whatever, that, what sort of thought might emerge out of that. And I think, the one gift that we share amongst ourselves is that capacity to do that with each other.
Can I just give an example of this?
Sure.
So obviously, Craig being the other American, and me being probably the most neurotic of the group, he's constantly getting inundated by me at 3 a.m. And Craig often
Please subscribe to our Patreon.
like, I deprive this man of so much sleep, it's crazy. But like, I'm not even gonna. Okay. So there are moments where, like, for example, a discussion that we have leads to attention on our reliance or dependence on psychoanalytic tropes, really. That, like, I remember once like a passing comment Craig made while I was driving my car somewhere. I remember I was in my car. Craig was like, "You're kind of the reason I'm getting back into psychoanalysis." So, in that comical sense, yeah, like the aleatory nature of friendships that have a philosophical dimension, because all friendships are philosophical, first of all, and all friendships are political. And here's the thing: no friendship has anything to do with society, right? And everything to do with that which escapes imposed community, right? And this is why, for example, the common Marxian, this sort of saying is that which divides us or that which alienates us is precisely what we share. So yeah, like in this sense, like so much of this book came out of just sharing space and torments together. So yeah, it's like a series of panic attacks. I don't know.
I was sharing most of the space.
In terms of the narrative we was going to take the reader through particularly, it starts off from this very hyper-aestheticized cyberpunk analog, diagram, I guess, of society, moving through something which is, then it goes into the introduction to cybernetics and how to fight cops, and then we start off with the cybernetic state of things, the concept of cybernetic understanding and the most relevant, really, applications, as well as the history. And then with Ocularity, the big catalogue, the most fictional thing, because it felt like the only way we could best provide it as a tool to the reader would be in this fictional form where you can reverse engineer it. The thing is, with a lot of counter-insurgency manuals, they do have built-in fail-safes in case anyone else gets them. But if you make one out of critical theory, people, okay, so fail-safe isn't that. And then after that, it's giving the limits of control. And then after, because when you reach the limits, and this is a very point from Hegel, I think one of his few good ones, when you're at the limit of something, the border of something, you could already see the other side of it. You're already on the way there, conceptually speaking. And so by turning up sort of the intensity of the description of control to its limits, we find what's on the other side. We find the abnormality of anarchy, the disability theory of anarchy. It tied up with these prison revolts, these revolts against poor inadequate busing strategies against inaccessibility. And then we sort of leap even deeper, zooming into the production of the psyche and its images itself, even going so far as providing a theory of fascism and what escapes it, particularly for the work of someone like this guy Klaus Fulewitz. Really interesting book he just called Male Fantasies, which is he looked through the journals of the Freikorps, basically the German version of the EDL with uniforms, and he looked at all of their dream journals and their fantasies and said, okay, we're seeing the limits of them escaping their own kinds of control, their sort of very much identifications with femininity, their fears about femininity. And I think we're moving from a position of capture to escape. Here's how the functions of capture work, and here's how the thing that they presuppose is the escape we're talking about now.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
I was just curious, when you were talking about control, there was an element you mentioned about this kind of idea that control requires an opposition for control to work. And how does this play with ideas about kind of controlled opposition and kind of things that kind of masquerade as avenues of escape? And like, is this something that you address in the book, this kind of like dealing with things that sort of like seem like they're the way out, but then they're actually kind of constitutive to the present state of things in some way?
Yeah, well, I welcome the controlled opposition, and I ask it to go further and vote Labour. I mean, in terms of controlled opposition, there is a description of picks the kinds of ways of using the metaphor. Well, not really a metaphor. It's the same process of a thermostat, which is letting off heat. Through opinion polls, certain concessions to the crowds. I mean, the fundamental metaphor is about a kettle, really. A kettle, you let off steam, you sacrifice part of the body of water you're boiling so that everything can still be operational, so that the kettle doesn't boil over, so it doesn't explode and things go out of control. And there are ways in which one of the ways of controlled opposition is to render the lost part of the body as a sacrifice of the greater good of it. I mean, there's an example I give in that chapter, actually, when Nancy Pelosi says she thanks George Floyd for his sacrifice because we all had this great awakening. There's nothing more disgusting, is there, really? It's this rendering intelligible of the system to itself in a way that diffuses opposition in advance. I mean, the idea of controlled opposition is the opposite, it's the only opposition which is allowed in advance. I mean, this is the function of the Starmerite Labour Party. The press is simply a negative feedback mechanism. If they don't like you, you're like, well, we won't get into power. It's the reason why for their cowardice regarding the ceasefire vote a couple of days ago. So the idea of controlled opposition is very central to the entire project of control opposition. It requires resistance, but however, despite the fact that control requires resistance, control recognizes certain kind of resistance. It can't recognize others because its categories of recognizing are often so historically conditioned by certain patterns that it can't necessarily always see them. This is the example we gave in Haiti, the example we gave with the ADAPT protest and the Tool protest. The system can only receive what is receivable to it. And the problem is that the territory actually does precede the map. Sorry to Comrade Baudrillard. There is actually a preceding reality, because otherwise they wouldn't need to be so much policing. And one of the lessons I think of what we're doing is look for the policing, because then you find the limits of control. Because control needs error to learn, but it can't necessarily recognize how hostile error is to itself. Because it can only render it as error. not as something standing on its own 2 feet with its own life, ideas, and consciousness, which is itself a material force. I mean, hopefully that addresses some of the points, beyond the Keir Starmer impression.
And its uncertainty and indeterminacy besides. Yeah, definitely. Any other questions? Yeah, I think my my GoPro recorder has had enough. It's actually flashing. It looks like the book cover, the ocular eye. It's spinning at me right.
It's like Cybernetics will use to report this.
Well, with that said, I just want to thank everyone once again. I mean, I say it all the time. My gratitude is immense for all of the support that people have put out to us. There's challenges that we face, behind the scenes, new challenges now, especially in our role with Repeater Books and Zero Books. We have a new imprint of books coming out called the Zero Horizon series. The first book to be released on it is by Ian Allan Paul, called The Reticular Society, very much in the vein of what we're doing here. And we have another book scheduled, one or several niches with, it's Will and I and some friends of the podcast as well. Tariq Goddard wants me to do a book on alchemy and communism. I don't know what the hell I'm going to do. I picked up some books here today that hopefully help me with that and other things. 2 more? Yeah.
And 2 more.
We also have I'm doing a new foreword to the first sort of properly edited edition of Mark Fisher's PhD thesis, Flatline Constructs, on cybernetic theory fiction and Gothic materialism. There's also another book on Zero Horizons I'm doing called The New Flesh, or Simulacra and Stimulation and Data Economy, which develops a lot on the capitalism of data. And of course, this Tuesday at 10 the Books in Cecil Court, just off Leicester Square, myself and Billy Cashmore, whose book is here. There are 2 copies. We Here Only Ourselves, Utopia, Memory and Resistance, also out on Zero Utopia. Yes, Zero Books. It's not shit anymore. Right, we will be doing a discussion of both of us on Anti-Oculus and the themes of cybernetics, negativity, and utopia. And on that note, I think there's nothing else. No more plugs?
Just free Palestine.